Well, welcome, guys. For those of you who are new, my name's Gavin. I serve as the lead pastor here at Tribes Church, and we are, as David said, juiced is a great term. I guess we'll just keep using that one. We're going to stick with it. I love it. But we're so excited you guys are here. You're jumping into what is now week 2 of a series we're in called Here as in Heaven. And before I kind of recap and dive into what we talked about last week a little bit to set it up for you, I got to share a bit of a story with you because I think deep down we all, if you guys are anything like me, like we're really not that outdoorsy anymore, right? Like we do everything we can in our lives to try to insulate ourselves with all the comforts we can afford to finance. And we live indoors, especially in Texas where it's climate controlled, right? And everything's comfortable. And that's the way that we live. Some of you might be adventurous and you go out for a camping trip. And if you're that person, in my mind, I want to be that person. But deep down, I know like I'm not outdoorsy. Like I'm not going to do it. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to be miserable. And so I went on one amazing camping trip when I was in high school. In fact, I was a senior in high school, and my best friend, his family went on this massive fly fishing and camping trip in central Montana at Glacier National Park, and they invited me to tag along. It was a 10-day trip because we were driving there, so it took us like 3 days just to get there. It was overwhelming, and then 3 days to get home, so we were probably only there 4 or 5 days. But I can't explain to you the stars that we saw at night out in this secluded forest in Montana and the streams that flowed through that place as we went fly fishing and we caught trout and we cleaned our own fish. I mean, there was just something beautiful about being there. But one of the highlights of the trip was supposed to be my friend and I. We're seniors in high school. We're kind of it's that coming of age time. We're supposed to be manly, right? We were going to plan to leave the camp with the rest of the family for a couple of days. And we were going to hike up further to see one of they call them glaciers. Really, it's just like a frozen pond that always stays frozen, right? And so we were going to hike up to this frozen pond. We were going to set camp up there and come back. And so we were just going to be gone for one night all by ourselves. We planned it out. We packed all the provisions we needed and we set off on this 9-mile hike up the mountain. And I'll never forget that day. Like it was so exciting, so fun. Everything went so smoothly. We took everything we needed for the trip. We planned ahead. We're like, hey, we're adults now. We can do this. And along the trip, we were probably around 10 a.m. We had just set out a couple hours before. We passed this awesome stream. And so we thought we'd stop and do some fishing because we knew we had to eat at some point. And so we caught a couple of fish and we strung them up. And neither one of us thought about the fact that we're really not going to build a fire that we can cook those fish on for another 8 or 10 hours, but that's okay. Let's string them up and just carry them with us. It's no big deal. Didn't even think about packing them in ice or anything like that. We're just going to carry them along. And so dangling off the back of my friend's backpack were 2 trout that we had strung up, and we kept walking. At one point, he dropped his backpack, and they dragged in the dirt for a minute, and we didn't catch it. Anyway, we just kept taking them with us. And that night, as we set up camp, we were so excited about, building a fire and making our own meal and living outdoors, right? We'd planned this. We're ready. And so we built our fire and we cleaned the fish and we put the fish on this makeshift little grill that we had made and brought with us. And then he also had this camping pot or whatever. And we put it over the fire and boiled some water. And we had what every high school senior dreams to have with fish. We had ramen noodles and it was fantastic, right? And so we had our fish and our ramen noodles and you would have looked at us and thought that we were kings. We were sitting back so proud of ourselves for planning so well until 3 hours later when we both were violently ill. I can't explain to you how sick we got that night because we didn't think about preserving the fish. Those fish were not good anymore. We had been dragging them around all day and neither one of us really thought about it because deep down, we're not that outdoorsy. There's a reason why you and I like to live indoors. And so I share that story as a joke to open up, but the truth is I think all of us realize we try to do everything we can. In fact, we go to great extents in this life to bring comfort into our existence. We a lot of times shield ourselves with this idea of comfort and we plan in order to not have to be put into positions where we'll be uncomfortable. And so if you're a camper, you're a glutton for punishment. You want to be outside. The comedian Jim Gaffigan once said his wife wanted to go camping more often, and she's like, camping's a tradition in my family. And his response was, it was a tradition in all of our family until we invented the indoors. There's a reason we live inside. Let's just go inside and enjoy it. And that's kind of where I realize I've been. And so I share that story as we open because I think that you and we do everything in this life to bring comfort into our world. But what we're going to discover today is that this world is not permanent. The dwellings that we build are not meant to stand forever. And the comforts that we try to bring to our life are temporary. And Jesus has called those of us who follow him to live a very different type of life than just to seek after more and more comfort. So opening last week, we jumped into this series called Here is in Heaven, where we're looking at a teaching of Jesus. Really, it's a prayer that he prayed to model to his followers what it should look like when you're in relationship with the God of the universe. It's often called the Lord's Prayer. This beautiful prayer that talks about just the bigness of God is what we looked at last week. It opens with this idea that his kingdom would come and his will be done here as in heaven. And today the attention will turn to how we have need and how he meets those needs. So we have the words on the screen. It's found in Matthew chapter 6, but I'm just going to ask you to read the Lord's Prayer or recite it along with me as we get started today. And we're going to skip that opening little phrase. So we'll start with Our Father. Ready, set, go. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Why don't we pray together before we dive in? Jesus, thank you so much for already being here among us. Thank you for the words that you have given us to model what it looks like to be in relationship with the God of the universe. That we could pray to him, and because of your blood on the cross, we can be forgiven and brought into relationship with God the Father. Lord, we trust and know that your Spirit is already here among us and at work, and we pray that your Spirit would stir up in our heart more affection and love for you, for your word, a greater understanding of what you've called us to do here in this world, and that we would be agents of bringing your will and your kingdom here as it is in heaven. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Amen. And so last week we talked about the idea that God's kingdom would come and his will would be done here as in heaven. And it kind of opened up the framework for our whole series. And if you remember what I talked about last week, the opening lines of this prayer are very focused on God. First of all, it says our and us and we all over the place. It never says me or mine or I. It's all about this community, this gathering of believers in the local church. But our focus right out of the gate isn't like, God help me, or I need you to do blank. The focus at the beginning is our Father in heaven. And last week we talked about the crazy paradox that we could have this understandable relationship with a father, with an unfathomable God. So we have this understandable relationship with a God who's out there somewhere, who's bigger than just physics. We can't understand or fully define or know him in all of his majesty. And Jesus opens with, we have to have this perspective on God the Father before we dive into our need, because it changes everything. And so last week we talked about what heaven is all about. And ultimately, yes, it's somewhere out there and spiritual. When we die, we're in heaven with our soul. Like spiritually we're there, but ultimately the hope throughout the scriptures is resurrection. And so it's all about Jesus ushering in a new heaven and a new earth here one day. And we get to partner with him in making all things new. And so it's our duty to make it a little bit more like heaven here in Argyle and the surrounding areas. We get to be a part of the mission of Jesus. Now that we have that framework in mind, we could turn the corner a little bit. And Jesus challenges us to turn the focus now to our need. So it's first focused on God and his bigness and his capability, and then the turn goes to our needs. And can I just say, like before we dive in, what we're acknowledging when we pray this prayer as we dive into the scriptures, even if you're not sure where you are in your faith and you're journeying this thing out, what this prayer acknowledges is that God knows our need. It's that God knows that we have needs. We get to be in relationship with this all-knowing, all-powerful God of the universe, and he knows your needs. He knows every intimate detail in your life. We're going to dive into this idea a little bit more next week, but he knows everything that's ever happened, will happen, or is happening in your life, and he loves you all the same. And so we serve a God, and we are in relationship with a God who knows the intimate, tiny details of our lives. He knows what wakes you up at 3 a.m. and causes crippling fear and worry and anxiousness. He knows the concern you have at work. He knows the frustrations you're dealing with your neighbor. He knows the parenting styles that you're trying to wrestle through. And he knows the sin struggle that you think is kind of hidden and you're trying to work on. He knows what's going on in your life, and he loves you and extends grace to you and wants to bring out the best in you for his name's sake and for your good. He knows everything about you. So as we turn the attention to our need, we have to acknowledge first that God knows our need, that he hears our prayer, but then second, that he can do something about our needs. It would be wasted oxygen for us to just pray a prayer that we're about to pray, asking for God to answer our prayer if we don't truly believe he can do something about it. We don't have time to dive into it in its fullness, but God absolutely calls us to partner with him and to be his hands and feet here in the world. And he will call us to work. If you look in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, there's this idea that Adam and Eve, they're equipped to be co-creators, to partner with God in the continued work of creation. So you and I can't just say like, God, fix this, and I'm going to sit here and watch, and it's going to be awesome. He absolutely can and will do that sometimes in your life, but more than likely, he is going to use the community of believers. He is going to challenge you to take steps to grow on this journey. It is our partnering with his provision. And it's when we partner with his provision, the world starts to change. So it's with that in mind that God knows and hears our prayer, that he knows our need, and he actually can do something about our need, that we turn our attention to the petition. And a petition is just a fancy word for like prayer request, right? To the petition that Jesus raises for us today. It's give us this day our daily bread. Give us this day our daily bread. It's with this idea of our need in mind that we go before God. He's not just this magic genie somewhere that grants us our wish, but rather we have this loving Father. I love how the prayer opens with the idea of our Father who art in heaven. He's a loving Father, and so there's going to be times where he looks you and I in the eye and he says like, no, because that's not the best thing for you. Like my kids, when they come to me right before dinner time and they're starving and they want a snack and they go into the pantry and they find the Halloween candy that first of all is like 5 or 6 months old at this point. It's getting a little bit out of date, right? And also it's like almost dinner time and they throw a fit because they want candy. And I would be a bad parent and a worse husband, right? Because my wife is cooking dinner if I look at them and I say, yeah, go for it. And so this loving God who knows our needs, there are going to be seasons where he needs to tell you no, and that is for your own good, and that is a beautiful thing. But when we approach the throne of God, when we enter into this conversation with God, which is all prayer is, this conversation and this relationship with the God of the universe, we get to say things like, give us this day our daily bread. Give us this day our daily bread. That's the first need that Jesus addresses. So first of all, notice the physical piece of this prayer. It's not just like, give us the faith that we need to navigate this day. Give us just the spiritual strength we need to endure this emotional thing that we're going through. It's no, give us this day our daily bread. It's very physical. And so God doesn't just care about your spiritual development, your spiritual well-being. He cares about all of you. He cares about what's going on physically in your life. And Jesus calls us to pray, give us this day our daily bread. Now, I think what we so often do, especially in 21st century America, we like to look at everything in the Bible just through our own lens, and we don't think about the history and the context and what Jesus was actually saying. And so if we were listening to a first century Jewish rabbi praying this prayer, which Jesus, by the way, was a Jewish rabbi in the first century. Just that's why I said that if you didn't know. And he was very much God in the flesh, and yet we can't pluck him out of the world that he lived in. And so if you are a Jew who was his primary audience during this teaching, if you're a Jew listening to this Jewish rabbi and you're listening to him teach and he says, hey, when you pray, you should pray like this, and you hear him say a phrase, give us this day our daily bread, something would immediately trigger within you. This isn't just like an empty word for like, God, give us enough bread for today. Or here, like give us enough tortillas to make it through the rest of the day, right? Because tortillas are better than bread in every circumstance. You guys, okay, some people were not as excited about that as I was. That was when I worked at On the Border in college. It doesn't matter. I used to pray this prayer to people, give us this day our daily tortilla, and they didn't think it was near as funny. Neither did you, so I'll just put that one to rest. But in the same way, like in the first century, if we were listening to this Jewish rabbi, this term daily bread would immediately trigger something for us. This was not just a prayer for God's provision, which it is, and we're going to dive into the heart of that in just a moment, but it's also a tie-in to something God had already done in Israel's history thousands of years ago. As Israel left Egypt, they were slaves in Egypt, and God miraculously pulled them out of slavery and captivity. And he said, I remembered the promise I gave to your forefather Abraham, and I'm going to fulfill that promise and give you the promised land that I swore to him, the thing that I covenanted with him. I'm going to see that through. And so he called this guy named Moses, and Moses was kind of scared, so he's like, let me bring my brother Aaron and we'll kind of lead the people together. And God said, fine, now go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. And there's this whole story, right? After they miraculously leave Egypt, they miraculously cross the Red Sea and go into the desert. And I want you just to think of one detail that we like to skip over when we think about like a camp and all that happens in Exodus and all that's going on in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, all the books of what we call the Pentateuch or the Jewish Torah, there is some fascinating things happen as God provides for these people in the desert. This isn't just a camp with like 15 people. We have to remember that the scriptures say that there were 600,000 men plus their wives and children that crossed the Red Sea that day. I'm no whiz at math, but let me tell you, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 to 2 million people that crossed over the Red Sea and are wandering in the desert. And God provides for these people with this bread that falls from heaven called manna. And in the first century, as Jesus says, give us this day our daily bread, his audience would have immediately thought of the manna God provided in Exodus. If you have your Bibles handy, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 16 today. Exodus chapter 16. We'll be starting in verse 1, and we're going to look at where this idea of manna starts from, what it means, what it is, and how it applies to our lives today. Starting in verse 1, it says, "They set out for Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt." So check your calendar, it's a real date, it's something we can track. "And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron." Remember, they're the two leaders in the wilderness. "And the people of Israel said to them, 'Would that we have died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out in the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger.' Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people should go out and gather a day's portion,'" their daily bread, just 1 day's portion every day, "that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not." Spoiler alert, they fail. And so here's what's happening, right? So Israel miraculously sees it's not even arguable, sees the miraculous hand of God pull them out of slavery in Egypt. He sends these plagues to Pharaoh because he will not relent and let the people go. After 10 plagues, Pharaoh finally says, "Enough, you can go." And then God divides the Red Sea and they walk on dry ground. If that isn't the miraculous hand of God, I don't know what is. And they get to the other side, and God causes the Red Sea to crash in behind on Pharaoh and his army who are chasing down the Israelites because he had a change of heart. And so they get on the other side and they immediately sing this worship song. And it's this beautiful account of all of Israel singing praise to God. And then here we are just a few chapters later, and they're like, "Would we just have died by the hand of God in Egypt, where at least we had meat pots and bread to our full?" I don't really know what a meat pot is, right? But I picture it's way better than a nasty trout and ramen noodles on the campfire that day, right? And this is what they're doing. They're at the campground and they're like, "We should have just stayed at the camp. Even though we were enslaved, even though it was miserable and we were baking bricks and building pyramids and we were oppressed by a vicious leader, even though we knew we had this promise from God, I wish we could have just died there and not seen our full potential. I wish it would have just ended there because at least our stomachs were satisfied." Can we just let that sink in for a moment? They just wanted to go back to Egypt so that they could sit by their meat pot, so that they could just have the food that they want to be full and to be satisfied. And it's so easy for us to look at them and judge them, but you and I, we do the same thing. We walk through deserts in this life, and in the midst of the desert, we think if I just had that, everything would be better. Israel's chief issue was the sin of idolatry, ultimately. They weren't faithful to God and they worshiped these false gods all over the place, but it doesn't start there. Idolatry always starts in this idea of envy and not being content. Israel looked around and they thought, if we were just with the Egyptians, we'd have enough to eat. If we were just like these other nations who have these gods or this king, you see them do this all the time. Instead of following God's way, if we just did it like these other nations, then we would be satisfied and we wouldn't be hungry anymore. And you and I, we can walk through the desert and we can say things like, if I just was like that person or had those means or didn't have to worry with these circumstances, then everything would be fine. We think the grass is always greener, and this seed of discontentment stirs up in our heart and it turns to envy, and ultimately we're not faithful to what God calls us to do because this root of envy has grown in our lives. It's real easy to talk about possessions, and if you drive an '07 Kia Spectra that's falling apart, you can look at some of the trucks in our area and be like, man, I don't want to envy that truck, but it's in the back of my mind, right? Like, it's really easy for us to kind of talk just about possessions, but it can so quickly go into like looking at our friend's spouse and the way that they treat them, and we can easily think, if I just had a spouse that blank, and the web of devastation that our enemy puts together in those moments is just overwhelming. It's in those little thoughts, if we don't take them captive, confess them to God, and turn from them and say, God, I know you are faithful, you are good. I'm walking through this dry season for a reason, and it is for your glory and for my growth and my cultivation, and I trust you even here and now. It's when we trust the plan of God and have contentment with where we are, everything starts to fall into its proper place. But that seed of envy, guys, it will and does destroy us everywhere. We get so caught up in our world, just on our devices, just scrolling through Instagram and Facebook and thinking, if I was just more like blank, if I just looked more like blank, or if I just had blank, then I would be happy, I would be satisfied, life would be easier, and this thing stirs up within us and we become like Israel. If I just had the meat pots and the bread to the full. But can I tell you, what they forgot is that they were slaves in Egypt and they were going to die there and never see the promise of God fulfilled. Guys, the thing that so allures us and the envy that so ensnares us is trying to lead us into enslavement, and it will destroy us. And so if we get so caught up in envy that we miss the plan of God, we become like Israel. We become just as unfaithful, and we become idolatrous, and we miss the good that God has in store for our lives. And it just starts with this discontentment in our soul. And can I tell you, it is a cancer in America. We struggle deeply with this concept. And since you guys have liked that so much, let's continue on. I know it's hard to hear and it's overwhelming, but we all deal with it. Let's jump down to verse 13 of chapter 16, where it continues. So let's learn a little bit more about what this manna stuff is. In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp. So seriously, right, we've got to stop for a second. Like, I always picture this as like a couple dozen quail are on a tent somewhere. Again, 1.5 to 2 million people in the desert. This isn't a couple dozen quail. This is like a scary movie of birds amount of quail everywhere. And it's like, what on earth are we going to do with all of these things flying all over the place? God is providing overwhelmingly and abundantly for 2 million people in the desert. And it's all miraculous. You can see the hand of God. And yet they're saying, if we just had that meat pot, everything would be better. And in the morning, dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing. So we don't even know what to call it, right? It's this fine flake-like thing. I love how descriptive this is. Fine as frost on the ground. And when the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? That literally in Hebrew is manna. The word manna means, what is this? Like, what is it? I have no idea. I don't even know what to call it. So they called it, what is it? Just like if you and I were to call something that's literally what they were saying. They called it manna, which means, what is it? Like, we're dumbfounded by this dew bread stuff, right? So verse 15, I think, is where I left off. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? Sorry, I just read that. For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. Man, we could just spend all day talking about gather as much as you can eat. Not too much, not too little. Gather as much as you can eat. You shall each take an omer, which is, I don't know how many gallons. I don't know what to tell you. According to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent. And the people of Israel did so. They gathered, some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. It's almost as if God is using this omer to spiritually say, like, okay, you took too much here and you're not going to have anything left over. And you took too little here, but I promise you're not going to run out. It's so overwhelming to see how they gathered. And so verse 19, and Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it over till the morning. But they didn't listen to Moses. Of course, they failed the test that God gave them. Some left part of it until the morning, and it bred worms, and it stank. So picture that trout. Like, it wasn't growing anything, but it stank. I can tell you that much. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat, but when the sun grew hot, it melted. So There is so much that we could talk about in this and how it applies to our life today. But picture Israel, like the quail's everywhere and it's kind of creeping people out, but it's like, God, thank you for providing, right? And it's like, what is it stuff on the ground that we're going to gather up, and it's kind of wet, right? So when the sun comes out, it melts, but there's bread in the wetness. So gathering it is not like pick up a loaf of bread. Like it's a bit of a chore to gather this stuff. So they're gathering it in, and the people of Israel are like, look, I know God sent like this overwhelming flock of quail for us, and he rained bread, literally rained in the moisture of the earth, bread down from heaven for us to eat, but I don't know that he'll do it again. I know he said just to do it today and just enough for what we need now, but I can't trust that God's going to provide like this again. I don't know that we're going to have everything we need, so I'm just going to go over here. I'm going to gather in a little extra, and I'm going to kind of hoard it away, and I'm not going to share it with those around me. I'm going to take more than I need. And what they do is they discover that there's worms growing in it, and it stinks because it's rotting. And Moses gets angry because he's like, God said daily, like it's going to happen every morning. Why are you so worried about this? Would you trust him? And so they overstep the law that God had given them. They overstep the command to not gather in too much, and it stinks. So you and I think we fall into this same temptation in our worlds today. We have been given talents by God, and we might run around and say, like, I need some more stuff. I need to make my life a little more comfortable. I need to shelter myself from the daily provision of God because I don't want to have to feel in the moment like I depend on this outside being to provide for me. And so in the midst of creating all of these comforts, we are saying to the hand of God, like, we don't need you. And can I just tell you, our stuff stinks to him. And honestly, we know deep down, like nothing that insulates us, no amount of money in a bank account and no amount of stuff that gives us status and prestige and comfort in this world, at the end of the day, gives us any more comfort than a worm-infested bunch of manna that reeks. At the end of the day, we know that this is not all there is, and it's just not worth keeping. We get so caught up in our world gathering more manna, and God is saying, it's daily bread, and I've got more of it for you. And so we kind of have to step back and think about this for a moment. Like, our God knows our needs, and he calls us to collect this daily bread. You and I, we aren't physically going out and gathering in this dew bread called what is it every morning. But the same principle applies to our lives. As Jesus is saying here, give us this day our daily bread. And if this God knows our needs, can I just tell you, he knows what you need, and he wants to provide it. But we get so caught up worrying about all of this stuff. We get so consumed with worry and with doubt, and we, like Israel, we gather in more than we need, and it just starts to stink. And it starts to control our lives. I want to jump ahead really quickly to Joshua chapter 5. The idea of manna, I love it, but it's temporary. It doesn't last forever because God has a point for this desert wandering season in Israel's history. And the point is to show us a powerful spiritual truth today. In the midst of our gathering more comfort and more to eat and more stuff, more accolades and success for us to hide behind, we lose sight of what is really important. And God is about to show us just how temporary and fleeting this stuff is. Starting in verse 10 of Joshua 5. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening. I love how like our Bible is full of like these dates and these things that we can check outside the Bible. Like we saw both of these texts open with what day of the month these events took place. And in the evening on the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land. And there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. And so as soon as God brings them into the promised land, they had just crossed the Jordan River and into the land of Canaan, and there'd be all kinds of battles at hand as they take over Jericho and the Amalekites and all of these other kingdoms that are inhabiting this land. But God has a plan, and he had brought them to their chosen land. No longer are they wandering the desert, starving to death. They step into the chosen land, the promised place. The produce is bountiful, and they eat of it. And the next day, the manna is gone. It's as if God's saying, I told you it would only be a little while. I told you it was temporary and I would provide. I told you that wasn't going to last forever. Quit longing for the things in Egypt. I have produce. I have a feast for you here and now today. He had promised them a promised land. And you and I think we are like Israel. We see this world as a desert at times. And as we're walking through the desert in this world, we think we've just got to get more stuff. We can't trust the provision of God. But can I tell you, like Israel's years in the desert, our lives here on this earth, the way that we see it, are temporary. And the more we insulate ourselves, the more our stuff begins to stink, the less we come to rely on God, and the more that we miss the feast in the age to come. As we will one day, just like Israel went into the promised land, we will enter into a promise of God. Because of Jesus' death and resurrection, we will have new life, resurrected life, like we looked at last week as we opened with the Lord's Prayer. And in that age, we will feast like we've never imagined before. It's not just spiritual and somewhere out there. It'll be physical and spiritual. It'll be life to its fullest with no more sin, no more shame, no more tears or suffering. Jesus will put an end to all of that ultimately. And you and I, we can be busy gathering in more stuff, or we could be busy gathering in more people for the feast and the party to come in the next age. And yet we get so caught up in this stuff. It's only temporary. And it is so fleeting. In fact, Jesus talks on this in Matthew chapter 6. I know that's where the Lord's Prayer was. He actually unpacks this idea a little bit further just after the Lord's Prayer in verse 19. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Does Jesus say you can't have clothes? Like, don't even wear clothes because moths could eat them. No, that's absurd. Does he say, like, don't have a bank account because a thief could break in and take it? They could steal your identity. No, that's not what he's saying. Does he say, like, don't plan for the future, don't invest, and don't try to take care of your family? No, he's not saying that. He's saying, where is your heart? Where is your treasure? Because if you're putting your treasure in all of this stuff, I can tell you that it's going to leave you disappointed. But if your treasure's in heaven, moths, those silly little ugly butterflies that eat through our clothes. Like, we're afraid of moths in this conversation. That overwhelms me. Moths can break in and eat through our clothes. Like, Jesus is this masterful teacher to take something so insignificant as a moth and help us realize how trivial our stuff is. A moth can destroy it. A moth. Like, you can take it out with a fly swatter and just a good aim. But no, a moth can break in and it can destroy your clothes. I love the tension in this text. And we can put all of our stuff in the bank, but if our hope is in our bank account, ultimately we're missing out on a larger hope. It's fleeting. It's temporary. There is a promised land to come. There's a feast to come. And Jesus' question is, where is your treasure? Because where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Is your treasure investing? Is your treasure moving up the ladder at your career and getting that next promotion or that corner office? Is your treasure perfect acting kids who always listen and always obey? Is your treasure having the kid make the scholarship as they go away to college? Is your treasure found in you placing your identity on things that ultimately make us stink and will fail us in this world? Or is your treasure on something so much more valuable where nothing can be destroyed? Are you investing in Bitcoin or are you investing in eternity? Like, ultimately, we get to invest in eternity with every decision we make, every conversation that we have, every way that we handle our finances, and every time we trust on God, we're trusting in eternity. There is a feast to come, and you and I, we need to learn to live in light of eternity, because where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. I think we get caught up a lot of times missing out on the idea of eternity, so I brought something to help us today. So I'm a visual learner, right? So I can't just like tell you what eternity is going to be like. Here, by the way, it's going to go on forever, and I have a rope that represents this that's that long. So just picture it goes on forever, right? Like, you can see the end of it. That rope goes on forever, guys. It's not even there. So let's just pretend like this is eternity, right? It just goes on and on. Let's just say I do this all day and it keeps going, like a magician pulling a scarf out of my sleeve. It just keeps on going, right? This is eternity. This is what is to come in the next age. And you and I, we kind of know that there's going to be heaven one day and out there and somewhere, and it's ambiguous and we don't think too much about it. But can I just tell you, like, it's there and it's real and it goes on forever and it's overwhelming. And yet in this age, we're living on kind of this part of our rope. This little black section. In light of eternity, this is our lives here and now. This is what we experience and we can see and touch and feel right now in the present age, this tiny little black section. And you might not be able to see how the threads are all woven together, but this little thread that's like sticking out up here to the right, like that's the meeting you're worried about tomorrow, right? That's that thing that you're dreading, the conversation you don't want to have at work. This one over here is like the thing that your kid is dealing with right now, which is real and it's very present, and God cares about your physical needs, but I mean, in light of eternity, like it's like a drop in the bucket. This is the life that we live in. And can I just say, like, sometimes we run around as if this tiny little black piece of rope is all that matters. And we put all of our time and our energy and our investment in this temporary, meaningless piece of rope. And all of eternity is at stake. Like, the heavens are around the corner, and we get to feast with the King of the universe. We get to be in relationship with our Father who's in heaven. And one day we're going to sit around a table and eat with him. And we're going to ask him, like, when you went to the cross for me, like, what was going through your mind as you took all of my sin upon yourself? We'll get to be with friends and family, and we will get to be a part of continuing in this process of making all things good. Guys, there's streets of gold in heaven. That's not just so we can float over them. Like, we will get to walk and manufacture and create and continue in the process of creation because we serve a creative God who calls us to create with him. And so one day we'll get to live there, but we're so worried about this black thing now that we never even think about the rest. And so we invest in the temporary, and we seek comfort in the temporary. And anytime we get any amount of suffering, we're like, we can't handle that. We're Americans, so we're just going to sidestep all the suffering. This relationship isn't working for me. I'm just going to check out and go find another one. And in light of eternity, that is a really narrow-minded point of view. We get to be in connection with the God of the universe who's calling us to live in light of eternity. Yet we get caught up in the tiny little black fibers of our everyday existence. And so just a few weeks ago, my wife and I were home with our youngest, who's not in school yet. He goes to preschool a couple days a week. And he comes running around the corner. Nicole and I were in I'm going to call it my office, right? And she runs our kids ministry. And she probably came in to talk with me about something with kids ministry. And we spent like a minute and a half talking. But a minute and a half in Jude's hands is like fire, right? Like, it's bad. You get that boy a minute and a half, he will set the world on fire. I'm not even kidding. And so Nicole comes in to talk with me for a minute and a half, and our back is kind of to him. And then he walks in the middle of our conversation, and I can't even tell you the excitement on his face. He's like grinning from ear to ear. He's overwhelmed and so proud of himself and so excited. And he goes, Mom, Dad, come quick, close your eyes. I made a scavenger hunt. And so he sticks out his hands, and we grab his hands, and we have our eyes like half closed because, believe me, you're not following this 4-year-old with your eyes closed. It's dangerous, all right? He cuts the corners way too shallow, and you hit your elbow every time. It's without fail. So we're kind of like half peeking, right? And he takes us into the kitchen, and he says, okay, open your eyes. And we open our eyes, and he goes, okay, follow the clues. And I look at our kitchen, and in the midst of moving into our house, my boy had found a nail somewhere. And I don't know where, somewhere in the toolbox in the garage, right? It wasn't in the right place. And so he had gotten a nail, and he'd gone into our kitchen, and he'd scratched clues into our kitchen cabinet. And not just like in one place, like in 4 different places, like big scratch marks. Come over and you can see them. I think we're going to leave them forever, right? There's these big scratch marks and like this hieroglyphic 4-year-old gibberish that he put on the cabinets. And we open our eyes, and Nicole's response was like, oh, buddy. And my response was like, oh, I'm going to kill him, right? Like, I just had a meltdown. I couldn't believe that he scratched that into our cabinets. And both of us took a deep breath, and we tried to say, Jude, you can't do that to our house, buddy. Like, that's not good. You've ruined our kitchen cabinets. And can I tell you, like, in the moment, I wanted to freak. And we didn't even finish the scavenger hunt. We didn't even go on and see what he had at the end of the hunt because we were so caught up in the cabinets. But can I tell you, in light of eternity, it's a kitchen cabinet. Who cares? It doesn't mean anything. My relationship with my son will go on in eternity forever. I will be connected to him forever, and the way that he remembers how Dad reacted when he put together a scavenger hunt will be imprinted on his soul. And I'm worried about these cabinets. Like, who cares about the cabinets? And yet you and I, we do this every single day. We get so caught up in the trivial, temporary stuff. And I can tell you, God will provide again tomorrow because he provided yesterday, and he's good. We've got to put our perspective on eternity. And we need to learn to live in light of eternity and not just for the temporary, fleeting, trivial stuff that consumes us. And it's as we learn to put our mind on eternity that God does something in our heart. When our treasure's in heaven, our heart is in bringing as many people with us to heaven as possible. When our treasure is in heaven, we can be a generous people who give away as much as possible to help those in need in our community. When our treasure is in heaven, we're not worried or freaked out when things don't go our way politically or when a storm comes. Like when our treasure is in heaven, we are a people of action and of love and of ushering in your kingdom come, your will be done here as it is in heaven. If we would just get that perspective, guys, Jesus could unleash, by the power of his Spirit, amazing things in this community. But if we just live for the black line on this rope, guys, we'll never experience all that God has for store in us in this life. Eternity will be there regardless. Jesus died on the cross for you regardless. You put your trust in him. You live with him in eternity forever regardless. But I want to hear him say, well done, good and faithful servant. And that starts with us living in light of eternity. May we be a people who put our trust not in the temporary comforts of this desert, but be a people who put our trust in heaven. Would we so live on fire for Jesus that we are so missional in everything that we do that we can't give away enough or help others enough so that they could come to experience the grace and the love that we've experienced in our own lives. May we be a people who live for heaven and usher that in here and now. Let's pray. God, thank you for this simple reminder that you care about our need, you see our need, and you will provide for our needs. God, if there's anyone in this room struggling financially or has some need going on in their lives today, I pray, Lord, that you would bring them comfort and joy and that they would have the courage in this community of believers to ask for help so that we can circle around them. God, you've called us not to hoard extra manna that rots and stinks and gets infested with worms, but rather, God, to take only what we need, to share with those around us, to be a people who are radically devoted to showing your love in our gathering, but also to the ends of the earth. God, would we be a people that give away more and more and more the more we come to know you, so that people in this community could be impacted, so that missionaries overseas would not be worried about budget as they live in a foreign land and learn a foreign language so they can share the gospel to unreached people groups. God, would we be a people who are more concerned with heaven and ushering that in here? And now, Lord, as we sing, I pray, God, that you would be here among us, that you would be glorified by the simple song that we sing, God. And would we be overwhelmed by the truth that everything we have is yours? God, you've given us everything. As the book of James says, every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights. God, the work of our hands, you gave us the ability to produce it. The breath in our lungs, as we're about to sing about, God, you gave us that breath as you breathed life into Adam and have then given a process by which every person could come to breathe oxygen. It is your breath that fills our lungs. So God, we can't help but turn and praise you. I pray that this week would be marked by our realization that you give us everything we have. And since it's all yours, God, I pray that it would be enough and we'd find contentment and we would partner with you in making an impact for your name's sake. It's in your name we pray. Amen.